Right now, somewhere, a kid is sitting in a classroom they didn't choose, following a schedule they didn't write, waiting for a bell to tell them when they're allowed to eat, play, or go home. That's just what childhood is, right? Structure, supervision, someone always watching, someone always deciding. For 99% of human history, that wasn't true. Not even close. If you picture a child living 30,000 years ago, you're probably picturing something grim, small, dirty, clutching a spear, forced to grow up fast, no time for play. Every day a fight to survive. That image feels obvious. It's also almost completely wrong. In 1963, anthropologist Richard Lee did something nobody had done before. He tracked the daily activities of one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer groups on Earth, hour by hour, day by day. What he found rewired how we think about prehistoric life. Adults spent about 15 to 20 hours a week total on food and survival. The rest of the time, they did whatever they wanted. If the adults had that much free time, what were the kids doing? The answer is one of the most consistent findings in anthropology. Researchers studying hunter-gatherer children across the world, in completely different climates, completely different diets, completely different continents, kept finding the same thing over and over. Children weren't expected to do any real work until their mid to late teens. Most of the day, every day, was simply theirs. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Nobody was teaching these kids in any formal sense. There was no classroom, no curriculum, no test at the end of the week. When anthropologists asked hunter-gatherer adults how children learned the skills they'd need for the rest of their lives, the answer was almost always some version of the same thing. They teach themselves through watching, through play, through getting it wrong and trying again. Adults occasionally offered a word of advice, but only when a child asked for it first. Nobody hovered. Nobody graded anything. There was no separation between learning and living, because the entire world around the child was the lesson. So picture it from the ground up. A child wakes up inside a shared camp with no walls, surrounded by adults who all act, in some loose sense, like parents. There's no morning bell. There's no rush. Breakfast is whatever's left from yesterday, eaten, while everyone talks and laughs and loosely figures out the day. And then the child simply disappears into it. By the age of 5, kids were already carrying real tools, just smaller. A bow sized exactly to a child's hand, carved by a parent or older sibling, not as a toy, kept separate from real life, but as the actual object they used to hunt small birds near camp. A miniature digging stick used to pull up real food from real ground. The pretend version and the real version were the same object. The only difference was size. Kids taught each other constantly, completely unsupervised. One shows another the right way to hold a blade. Another says, "Let me show you," while figuring out which vine on a tree is strong enough to climb. They'd argue, mid-task, over whether to cut footholds the way they'd seen done before. No teacher in sight. Just kids passing knowledge sideways to each other, building competence the same way every generation before them had. And the evidence for all of this isn't just observation of people living today, it's buried in the ground. At a site in Western Europe dating back 21,000 years, archaeologists found a small lion carved out of reindeer antler. The surface was worn completely smooth, not from one ceremony, but from years of small hands gripping it, carrying it, playing with it. At sites across Europe, researchers found broken spear points repaired with clumsy, unskilled hands. Almost certainly children practicing on damaged tools their parents no longer needed. Tiny bows, hand-carved dolls. Children weren't just imitating adult life out of boredom. They were building scaled-down versions of the entire world around them, one tiny tool at a time. Even cave walls carry their fingerprints, literally. Researchers studying ancient cave art have identified finger drag marks low on the walls, at a height that only a child could have reached. Hand stencils traced back to kids as young as 4 sit right alongside the work of adults. These weren't solemn sites reserved only for sacred rituals performed by elders. Children were in there too, leaving their mark next to everyone else, doing exactly what kids have always done given the chance, making something just because they could. Play itself wasn't gentle or quiet the way the word suggests today. Researchers studying play across dozens of ancient and surviving hunter-gatherer cultures found the most common form by far was intensely physical, hitting objects with sticks. Wrestling, grappling, kicking games, full contact running where getting tackled was half the fun. These weren't random. They mirror almost exactly the physical skills needed for hunting and for defending a group. One recent study tracking children's daily movement found some of them logging over 20,000 steps a day. More activity than most adults today get in an entire week. Somewhere between a game and training, kids were conditioning their bodies for adulthood, while just trying to beat their friends at something with no name and constantly changing rules. By around age 10, the line between play and reality started to blur on purpose. Boys would tag along on actual hunts, watching from a safe distance. Girls in many groups shadowed food gathering and the earliest stages of childcare. But this shift wasn't sudden, and it wasn't forced. Researchers describe it as a slow drift, not a hard cutoff. There was no single day where play ended and responsibility began. The pretend hunt slowly became the real hunt. Nobody marked the moment it happened, because there wasn't one. Now here's something almost nobody thinks about when they imagine ancient childhood. What happened once the sun went down? Before fire, the day simply ended at dusk. You found shelter, stayed still, and waited for morning, because moving in the dark meant becoming food for something that could see better than you. But fire changed everything, and for kids specifically, it created something that had never existed before. A campfire creates a circle of safety, and inside that circle, for the first time all day, there was nothing left to do. No food to find, no tools to make, just firelight and people and time. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wassner spent years recording real conversations inside a hunter-gatherer camp. What she found was that daytime talk was almost entirely practical. Who saw tracks where, which plants were ready, complaints about food sharing. But at night, around the fire, conversation flipped completely. The overwhelming majority of nighttime talk turned into stories, myths about how the world began, tales of ancestors who did impossible things, jokes that made the whole camp laugh. And children weren't sent away during any of this. They sat right there, soaking it in, night after night, year after year. This is where a child actually got their education in everything that wasn't survival. Who their people were, what their ancestors had done, what was dangerous, what was sacred, what was funny. Not from a lesson, but from sitting cross-legged by a fire at 7 years old, hearing the exact same story their parents had heard at 7 and their grandparents before that. An inheritance with no books and no classroom, passed mouth to mouth, fire to fire, for thousands of generations in a row. And then, eventually, sleep, though not the way you experience it now. The evidence suggests that for most of human history, people slept in two separate phases through the night, with a quiet, waking window in between. For a child, that strange middle-of-the-night stretch by a dying fire, surrounded by the sound of sleeping family, wasn't wasted time. It was just one more quiet, safe hour folded into a childhood that had very few hours that weren't, in some way, their own. Then, about 10,000 years ago, something changed everything. Humans began planting seeds and domesticating animals. And agriculture is a trap. Once you start farming, you can feed more people. More people means you need more food. More food means more farming. Populations exploded, and there was no going back, because now there were too many mouths to feed by hunting and gathering alone. You were locked in, and farming needed far more labor: plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, defending crops. The skeletal evidence is unambiguous. At early farming sites tied to major monuments, archaeologists have found children as young as 6 with arthritis already forming in their spines, almost certainly from hauling heavy loads as part of construction. Childhood didn't get safer once humans settled down. For a lot of kids, it got harder. The fire stayed lit. There was just less and less time left to sit around it. So here's what an actual day looked like for a child, before any of that happened. Waking up inside a shared camp with no walls and no schedule. A morning stick fight that's secretly teaching reflexes nobody named on purpose. Carving a small animal out of bone, copying something seen on a hunt last week, a foraging trip with a tiny bow built just for them, technically helping, mostly turning into a competition over who finds the most food first, splitting lunch with a friend for no reason except that it felt right. As the sun went down, settling by the fire to hear the same story they'd heard 100 times, never getting tired of it, falling asleep surrounded by the people who'd keep them safe through the night, waking briefly in the dark, and falling back asleep again, completely at peace. No bell, no schedule, no one deciding for them when play ended and work began, when the lesson started and stopped, when they were allowed to rest. You spent your childhood being told what to do, when to do it, and how long you had to do it for. They spent theirs being trusted by everyone, constantly, from the moment they could walk, to figure life out on their own terms. In a lot of ways, they weren't waiting for childhood to end so real life could start. They were already living it.